activating. Okay, so welcome everyone to this new event of Lean Agile Delivery and Coaching Network and Digital Transformation in London. Tonight we are hosting Mark Butcher from Made.com that we talk about making a team successful, how to start with the success in our team. So welcome Mark and welcome everybody to this event.
Thank you very much. I'll get started if that's all right then. I'll share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Get rid of that and present. Yeah, so thanks. I'm going to assume you can see my screen and you can hear me talking. And if you can't, then hopefully someone will inform me. But my name is Mark Butcher, and I'm going to be doing a talk today that I've titled Starting with Success. And it's really based on some observations that I've been making about how I think we could harness a different sort of side to root cause analysis to help teams get better at what they're already good at. Just a little quick intro then before we get started, and I wanted to then say a quick hello and ask you a quick rhetorical question. So this is me. My name is Mark Butcher. I'm a senior delivery manager based at an organisation called Maytech in London. We've got offices also in Bristol and Manchester. And we are public sector technology delivery experts. And so we work with a number of different enterprises within the public sector to help them modernize legacy technology, speed up their delivery of new services, and also help them embed new capabilities within them at the same time. I myself have worked in some form of delivery now for over a decade, and I've sort of been doing agile software delivery and software delivery more broadly for the last 6 of those years. Outside of work, I like to run. I try my very hardest to keep my houseplants alive, and I'm a football fan. And then just down at the bottom there are some of the organisations that I've worked with, both on behalf of Maytech, in-house, and also at other consultancy firms. So before we go any further, I just wanted to sort of plant a seed in your head and ask you a question as to, and not to answer verbally, but to have a quick think about it, like, when is the last time, or does this feel like a relatively familiar sight to you when you've been running or have been participating in one of your team's retrospectives? I suppose the points I'm trying to get across there are there's the sort of like what went well, what didn't go well, and actions have a sort of a small smattering of content around what went well, not a lot of coalescence there and not much discussion, and then much greater levels of agreement around the stuff that didn't go well, and those being picked as the areas for discussion that then actions get taken for, and root cause analysis gets taken for, and actions come off the back of the retrospective. For me, that feels like a relatively familiar sight. We'll come back to that in a minute though, but just wanted to give a zoom out of what we're talking about today. So I'm going to do a bit of a recap on continuous improvement, what I think it is and how I try to put it into practice at the moment. I'm going to pose an alternative approach to continuous improvement that I've been looking at, and then give some real life examples of where I've been doing that and what sort of successes I had from that, but also what struggles I've had with that, and some sort of takeaway tips that I'd advise. Then we've got time for questions and discussion at the end. So yeah, I think probably blocking up the questions and doing them all at the end might be easiest in terms of getting through the deck. So continuous improvement, first of all, then just a recap on what it is and why we do it. Oh, someone's trying to get in the room. I'll leave that to you. Continuous improvement, recapping on why we do it at all. So continuous improvement as a concept is nothing new. So it's a concept that is kind of a cornerstone, of the Agile Manifesto, and is the notion of inspect and adapt is a key part of the principles of the Agile Manifesto. Retrospectives, which are often sort of our vehicle for continuous improvement, are baked into Scrum and Kanban processes, and those are 2 of the most commonly used agile processes, so it's everywhere. And if you wanted to learn more about continuous improvement, either after this or any other time in your life, you could easily search that in Google and get 530 million search results and be well on your way to a number of different retrospective formats and ways to do continuous improvement. But what actually is it? So the definition that I've found, this is the simplest, which is on Wikipedia of all places, is that continuous improvement is an ongoing and incremental effort to improve products, services, or processes. And I think the ongoing and incremental part of that are important. It's about looking at things on a regular basis and looking at how we can improve the way that they work. When do we do it? So ideally we do it all the time. And I think much like agile software delivery as a concept, continuous improvement as a concept is something which is more of as much of a mindset as it is a mechanism for how we improve our teams and our processes. So we'll see it in our roles probably most often on deliveries. So that could be running the team's regular retrospective and looking at how they can improve their ways of working. We also will probably frequently do continuous improvement on live software. So looking at the KPIs that we've got to drive the product success and where we can tweak the product to achieve that. But also we might use it to enhance our internal operations. So we might look at the way that our business runs behind the scenes of the product and think about how we can do things in a slicker way. And how do we do it? So like I said before, I do think that continuous improvement is a bit of a mindset, and there's definitely a difference between people whose mindset is driven towards making things better constantly. And so I suppose like the way that it often manifests itself in teams is by doing some sort of root cause analysis. So we look at an event, we then do an analysis of how that event happened, usually something which was troublesome. And then we look at how we improve or make that so it doesn't happen again in the future. And those root cause analysis often in the world that we work in is some sort of a retrospective. And I think what I'd come across by doing a little bit of reading around on the internet and some of my own observations is that I think it's quite easy for us to slip into the trap of focusing all of our energy when it comes to continuous improvement on analyzing the root cause of stuff that hasn't gone well in the teams that we're managing and leading. So if you think back to this earlier, and when I asked you if this is a sort of a familiar sight to you, I think the reason I asked that is that based on my personal observations, this is a relatively familiar sight. So having that very small amount of attention paid to what's gone well, a large coalescence of information around what hasn't gone well, and then those being the subjects that we spend a lot of time analysing and then looking to try and forge discussion topics out of. I know there's a lot of work being done by a lot of teams to try and avoid that, but that's sort of a pattern that I notice rather a lot. And I think one of the reasons might be is that it's easier to talk about the things that aren't going well and look to remedy them than it is anywhere else. And I think that it's worth noting that that approach could well have some shortcomings. So I think the first up on those is kind of a sense that people could become tired of the traditional retrospective format that focuses primarily on the things that have not been going well in a team that we work on. And I think there's a bit of research around there that suggests that the continuous sort of language around human deficit that comes with the retrospective about things having not gone well and looking to improve those areas could be eventually harmful to people's engagement within a retrospective. I think there's also a risk that the humans in our processes become seen as the biggest liability. And the reason I sort of say that is when something goes wrong, when there's a fault in a process that we have, it's often because there's been a malfunction somewhere in that process. And it could be a technology, it could be the process itself, it could be a team, it could be a human being. And I think it's easy to see that human beings are the most variable of those possible malfunctions and therefore could potentially be seen as the greatest liability. And I think, like I said, there's a lot of work that people do try to do to remedy this. And I think things like the Prime Directive and setting out retrospectives to be a very safe space do a lot of work to overcome that. But I still think without a bit of reflection, we could fall into a slight blame culture issue there if not careful. And lastly, the other thing I want to pick up on as a potential shortcoming for this sort of traditional method is that there's a tendency to ignore a lot of the data that is being made available to us by our teams. If you take the example that I gave before about that retrospective board, there was an awful lot of stuff that the team said was going well, which no attention was paid to in that particular example, where there could be lots of valuable learnings. And to analogize this slightly, if you think about an engineering plant that's got 26 water pumps that run regularly, 5 of those pumps, for example, are malfunctioning and not working. The tendency, I think, is to conduct root cause analysis only on those 5 pumps that are failing and to ignore the 21 that are working. But that's an awful lot of data there that might explain something behind the 5 malfunctioning. So this got me looking at a slightly different approach, an alternative approach to how we could inspect and adapt within teams. And I guess the question that I posed to myself and I would pose to you as well is, what would happen if we put as much energy into analysing the strengths of our team as we do the shortcomings of our teams? And this led me to learning about a topic called appreciative inquiry, which is also sometimes referred to elsewhere as positive deviance. And at its heart, appreciative inquiry teaches us to look at the systems that we work in and to understand how and why they work so well. And a book has been written about this by a chap called David Cooper in the late 90s. And there's an awful lot of theory around it that probably isn't quite analogous to the sort of teams that we work in as software delivery teams. But I was quite curious to think about spending more time being sort of generally inquisitive about how and why things always work so well. And then looking at it more, there's an awful lot of applications of this sort of technique to a broad range of industries. So I've already mentioned engineering with the pumps. I've seen quite a lot of examples of it being applied in healthcare and also even in sport. So Vince Lombardi, who was a famous American football coach in the 50s or 60s, a long time ago, used to say to his teams apparently that they shouldn't spend any time focusing on the things that they're not doing well, and instead they should concentrate just on the things that they've done well and figure out how they do those even better and do more of them. Vince Lombardi went on to have the Super Bowl named after him, and is the most decorated NFL coach of all time. So one likes to think that he was onto something there. And I think what I sort of started to really like about the idea of appreciative inquiry is I could start to sort of feel familiar with the kind of some of the language you use about trying to replace the spiraling diagnosis that we do in teams with what they call discovery and dreams, which perhaps isn't necessarily language I would want to use, but the idea of spiraling diagnosis of going to a retrospective and every 2 weeks it being on the same sort of topic of we don't have this dependency working, or we don't have a good working relationship with that team, and that constant feeling of going around the drain rather than moving forward with anything. And lastly, this is a quote directly from the authors, who referred to appreciative inquiry as deliberate, rigorous research into the root causes of success, i.e. looking sort of very scientifically about why things are successful. And I think that's the bit that really caught my attention, because I'm a very sort of inquisitive and solutions-led person, but I find it much easier to do that in a sort of a retrospective scenario when looking at something that's not gone wrong, because I can look to sort of find the counter of that. I try my best to make the retrospectives that I run as kind of like a safer place to be as possible, but there's no doubting that deliberate and rigorous interpretation in certainly in a lot of meetings that I've been falls more so on the part of the retrospective, which is looking at the things that haven't gone well. So this is another example that I had and was one of my favorites, and it's well from outside the world of software engineering, but it's a nice story, and I thought it was a good one to sort of give as an analogous exercise. So this is about post-war Vietnam. I think it was in the 80s, where some workers from Save the Children were looking at the malnourished childhood population in Vietnam and trying to understand why a large number of the residents of Hanoi in particular were malnourished, and how to get them out of that cycle and how to break that cycle. And they embraced this sort of appreciative inquiry technique, or what they call positive deviance. And rather than spending their time spiraling in diagnosis of just looking at the things that weren't going well for the children that were malnourished, they decided to focus as much of their energy as possible on the parts of the families in Vietnam where their children weren't malnourished and they were living full and healthy lives. And what they found by doing that were some relatively straightforward things, that these children had access to freely available saltwater fish, freshwater fish, so crab and shellfish. They also had access to the leaves on potato leaves, which apparently, on sweet potato, which apparently vitamin rich. And they were eating at a more regular cadence than the children in the malnourished areas. So they were eating little and often rather than one hit. And so what the workers from Save the Children did is they applied those sort of three things to the children who were malnourished, and they saw that within 6 months there was a 2/3 reduction in the amount of sort of malnourishment amongst that group. And I think to bring it back to software development, and the kind of like analogous point there is, I think what they did really well here was they took that 10,000-foot bird's eye view and really zoomed out on the problem and looked at not just where that particular population was struggling, but where other populations were not feeling the same, and then managed to incorporate it into their lives successfully. So why might this approach work in our line of work? So firstly, I think it means we start to make use of the full data set available for us in driving continuous improvement. So if you think back to the example that I gave a little while ago about the pumps that weren't working in the engineering plant, and how I mentioned that only 5 weren't working, but the other 21 kept marching on. Think about what the engineering leads in that plant could learn by looking at all the reasons why those 21 pumps continue to work. Do they have a particularly good cleaning process? Have they got a particularly good root cause analysis process that gets them back going? Have they got a good fallover technique? Whatever it might be, there's all sorts of things about those 21 good actor pumps that could be learned to drive continuous improvement across the whole data set. Secondly, I think it makes it easier to adopt a human-centered approach that a lot of us strive for. And I say easier because I think that a lot of people probably are capable of finding a human-centered approach, or find it a lot easier to adopt a human-centered approach all the time, even when they're analyzing their problems. But I think for those of us who are quite analytical in the way that we think about problem solving, taking this sort of like deliberate and rigorous approach into the way that we do things well, it could well be slightly easier with this mindset. And lastly, I think it builds trust into our continuous improvement process and takes the retrospective and the root cause analysis away from being an exercise which is just looking at things that go wrong, and instead looking at the things that we do right and trying to use those to our benefit. It makes us feel stronger as a result. So I tried to eat my dog food and put this into practice. And so these are a couple of real world examples that I've been doing. I'm by no means an expert at doing this, but these are some of the examples that I've been doing at Maytech. So I've done this a few times now. I've done a handful of times just with product teams, so a number of different product teams that we work with, and multiple times on the one product team that I particularly manage. I've also done it with our leadership team at Maytech, and also as part of our delivery operations processes. I should explain delivery operations for us is we have a regular forum where we look at our entire portfolio of projects. We look at all the ones that are kind of struggling and in need of support, and we also mark out which ones are amber, I could need support in the future, and then which ones are green. And one of the things that I noticed is that we spent an awful lot of time talking about the projects which are struggling and didn't pay a lot of attention to the ones that were doing well, and in particular didn't pay attention to the ones that turned around in their nature. So just going through these examples then. Part one, this was with one of the product teams I work with. So we basically adapted existing techniques that were already used a lot of the time with retrospectives. So use the standard retro tool in identifying our strengths. So we use the Ishikawa fish diagram. So that was basically just a process of trying to write down the things that we're good at under specific headings, e.g. collaboration. And then we try to find the highest impact areas of those strengths, and then run a how might we exercise and try to work out how we might do more of those in other projects or in other parts of our project in the future. And so a good example here is that we looked at how we had a strong relationship with one of our partner teams, and we looked at and we sort of analyzed how we hadn't previously had a good relationship with them, but how we'd managed to build that up and develop it, and therefore how we could use that to leverage a better relationship that we had with another partner team who we weren't quite so close to. So I guess that's where it's analogous to that Hanoi example of taking that 10,000 foot bird's eye view and kind of comparing those sample sets. And the second part here is from that delivery operations world. So this is looking at a project that had been in our sort of weekly status meetings had been not very happy for quite a long time, and that sort of status meeting had been seeing them go through that for quite a long time, and we eventually got them to a place where the project was very happy and actually was one of the happier projects to work on within our company. And so we wanted to try and figure out exactly how that happened so we could try and recreate it on other projects. So we started off by looking at what the big wins had been that had got the delivery to green. We then prioritized though and picked a couple of ones that we thought were the most influential, and ran a kind of like a more rigorous deep dive root cause analysis into those using the 5 whys technique, which I'm sure a lot of you will have used before in other root cause analysis. And we did that to try and get down to the real root cause of why those things were successful. And from that, we found that we got to a root cause, and we had a number of logical actions that followed that we can apply to other projects in the future. And that specifically for us, it is about the kind of like the capability groups that we put around the leadership of our project teams is as impactful as the people that we put on the projects themselves at the doing level. So some practical tips from this. These are some things that I came across as I was going through the exercise myself. I wanted to make sure that I gave the opportunity to share them. So firstly is to always start with a zoom out. So it's really important, I think, to give the people that are involved in the exercise some context as to the way that you're planning to shape the exercise, and even sometimes give them a little bit of theory up front to get them into the right mindset. one of the reasons I say that particularly for this technique, and I guess it's the same for all really, but one of the reasons I say this for this technique in particular is that I don't think it's for everybody a particularly logical and normal way for them to think. I think people are used to talking about the things that teams are not good at, and I think they're a little bit less used to this. Getting them sort of primed and framed up front was really important. Secondly, making use of the tools that you already know. So I've given a couple of examples in here of where I've used tools like the Ishikawa fish diagram and the 5 whys and the how might we sort of exercise. I think using those in a different context makes it easy for you as a facilitator, but also makes it easier for the people doing it, the exercise, having been in that position before. And lastly, give longer than you think you need. So as I said before, I think it takes more brain power than you might think to do root cause analysis of your strength. So give people the time that they need, because the most important thing to this as a technique is coming out of it with as good a clearer crystal actions as you would do from a root cause analysis of something that hasn't gone well. Otherwise it won't be taken seriously. We're nearly there. So lastly, I just wanted to give a quick summary of what my key takeaways are. So firstly, we should take what our teams are doing well more seriously. And if we don't do that, we're not making use of the full data set. There's a lot of information that we have at our disposal about how well our teams are performing. And if we want to make them perform even better, we'd be remiss not to make use of that and analyze it further. Secondly, it is possible to rigorously assess our strengths in the same way that we do our shortcomings. It might just feel a little bit unnatural at first, both to you as a facilitator, or to me as a facilitator at least, but also to the wider group of people that we're running the assessment with. And lastly, this isn't just about retrospective. So I've really used those as the vehicle throughout this talk, because it's something that I certainly do every 2 weeks, sometimes more often, but have been doing for the last 5 or 6 years, every 2 weeks. But it's something which we could equally apply to other approaches to continuous improvement. And I think the delivery operations example I gave there about sort of a more significant win was a really good example of that. Whenever I've worked on a team that's, for example, met a large software release deadline and we've got it out on the time and it's been successful and it's got out into production well, the tendency that we have within teams, or I have within teams, is kind of to pop the champagne cork and have some cake and celebrate our achievements that way, not to stop and think, what is it that led us to being successful in that approach? Although this is not to say that we shouldn't do the champagne and cake things too. So those are my key takeaways. That's the end of the talk. So thank you very much for listening. We do have time for questions and discussion now. If anybody wants to stay in touch, these are my details. So it's firstname.lastname@madetech.com, which is the name of the business. And on LinkedIn, I'm /Mark/Butcher88. Welcome to print screen that if you'd like. And then lastly, here's some further reading.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, if you can leave the readings for just 1 second, if someone wants to, the references, the legend. Thank you. There are a few questions coming from Zach. Zach, if you can unmute and put your question to Mark.
Have I stopped my screen? I just asked.
No, you are not sharing the screen anymore.
No, okay, that's fine. Yeah, I just want to check that I'd stopped sharing. That's cool.
Thank you very much, Mark. I really enjoyed that. It's nice to see a bit of appreciative inquiry going through. What I've found is that we use a technique called creative climate assessment with teams, which is 10 dimensions to get into them. And that lets us see the strengths and weaknesses, which tie into the DDAT skills on one side, which the government loves, into Sophia, and the creative skills that the World Economic Forum have brought up, which is a way of doing it. So with appreciative inquiry, the last one we did in July, found that one of the team members out of a squad of 20 had raised with HR a complaint of institutional racism in a large publishing company. So the point that I'm making is that when teams play to their strengths, they can exclude other people.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would say though, I mean, that sounds like a.
Excuse me 1 moment.
I'll wait. I guess I can give my thoughts on that, but I suppose that I agree with that, but I think that the chance of exclusion isn't limited to appreciative inquiry and doing things that are positive, I think it's equally possible in the resolutions that we get to in any sort of form of root cause analysis to be exclusionary, whatever the word is, to exclude people, and we should avoid that at all costs. Like an example that I can always think of is that often like the answer to, or the proposed answer to the way that we try and improve communications within the team or improve team morale within the team is to have a social or to go for a drink, whatever it might be. And I think that's not necessarily, well, it's obviously not necessarily always the answer for everybody. Zach, I was just saying that I agree with the dangers behind the comment that you just made there, and how it needs to be avoided at all costs. And that I think that's something which we need to take in mind across continuous improvement across the board, whether or not you're doing it from a position of appreciative inquiry or otherwise.
Yeah, I think so. But I think that appreciative inquiry is the way to go. The other one that I find is that when you go up the layers in the company, 1 up, 2 up into the operations level and into the strategic level, they have different views on what the quality assurance and quality control should be. And usually with an agile team, we don't differentiate QC and QA, where QC is on the product, quality control, and QA is on the process. We tend to focus more on the process. So one of the things that I found that's very helpful is marginal gains.
Yeah, nice.
Where you take a team and they can apply a change. So if you're going in to try and change the mindset, it's a bit like when you're trying to up your running distance from 5K to 10K to marathon. It takes 6 weeks for the body to get used to it. And similarly with our brains and our habits, when we try to drop one habit and bring in a new one, it can take 6 weeks, which you don't get if you're trying to measure it off a sprint stats all the time. So the point you're making about lots of information not being picked up is not in the MIS that the people up above are looking at. But what I have found is that they will come in on red reviews, especially in government. GTS, you're going private to public beta and you'll get the red team review coming in. And at that point, they do tend to come in and go, right, where's this extra data that you've got? Yeah. They start asking you the questions as if it's a kind of military way of doing it. But yeah, marginal gains, I think, is really nice.
I really like it. And that's like, it was a big part of like the Dave Brailsford theory of British cycling as well, wasn't it?
Yeah. Sorry, I realise I've been talking a bit too much. I don't get out very often.
Happy to help.
So if somebody else wants to ask a question.
There is one comment from Katarina. Actually, I had a couple of questions in the chat, but if there are others, okay, let me share just one, okay? So the second one, I think, have you some experience of using this positive approach instead of the traditional negative one with the new teams? I mean, I think that it will be very positive to see the motivation that can create this point. So if you have made some comparison.
So no is the quick answer. I think I have primarily, this is something that I've sort of like stepped upon in the last year or so, and I've primarily done this on teams that I've already had up and running. And one of the things that I'm finding, or I have found, is that the change in mindset to go from constantly thinking about the things that haven't gone well to like trying to at least even split time evenly and split energy evenly from positive to negative is really hard. And I'm having to, it's sort of like a kind of like push along sort of situation. So I think that this is like, without a doubt, would be the way that I'd shape the way that the team did continuous improvement on a new team in the future. Because I think it's like, it is a mindset, and getting people into that, the sooner the better. It is the sooner the better, I think. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Zach, if you want to make another question. Okay.
Hi, this is Karina speaking. I'm having a question as well. That's also someone wrote it in the chat in regards of the SWOT analysis, to use it as well for teams. And there I'm having a question as well. Do you use that as well for your teams as well to look at them individually?
I tend to use SWOT analysis less for people and more for things, if that makes sense. So like if looking at like how we were going to go about, if we were like looking at comparison of feature A versus feature B that we were going to build next, I think it would be quite common to use a SWOT analysis in that situation. I don't think I necessarily, I mean, I guess like what you're really talking, not really talking about, one of the things you're mentioning there is there's a lot of similarities between this and SWOT. I guess you're right. It just focuses mainly on the S and O part of that. Whereas normally in our retrospective, we tend to focus on the W's and T's. So I haven't necessarily used SWOT as a technique on teams, but yeah, I guess it's picking up on a similar sort of premise.
Yeah, I'm using the SWOT analysis as well for the one-to-ones, that everyone is thinking about themselves, what I'm good at, what makes me happy, what I'm strong at, where do I see my weaknesses, and what do I see as well as opportunity to use my strengths to overcome my weaknesses. What is it I'm scared to do? And then I'm playing with that as well to push them to specific projects or roles, or picking up specific actions to make them even stronger, or use their strengths as well to overcome their weaknesses.
Yeah. That sounds like a very sensible thing to do with one-to-ones. I don't know if you've read or ever used the book StrengthsFinder, but or ever done like a Myers-Briggs assessment of your preference of working. But those sort of hold some sort of kind of similar premises, that it's like, these are the things that you're like not innately good at, but like these are the way that you prefer to work. So like, how do we help you like make the most of the things that you've already got good at and do more of those, rather than feeling you need to completely change the way that you work? Zach's got his hand up.
Yeah, with Myers-Briggs and all the other ones, Jerry Weinberg, the psychologist of the computer programmer, he did surveys with people, and they said, would you like us to use the same personality when we fill in different tests? And what I've found is really helpful in these areas is to use something like Joe Harry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you're familiar with that. So getting people to say what they think you're like in that context.
Yeah.
And then the benefit that I have found is that you can go back and ask the person, what did you mean by that? Can you give me an example?
Yeah.
And again, I think with SWOT, you're quite right in so much as it's an operational tool. As when you're dealing with individuals and teams, the climate, the team psychological space is the way to go. Yeah. So there's some stuff there that I'm more than happy to share if people are interested.
Good. There is a comment from Shade. Hopefully this is the right pronunciation. I don't understand if this is a question or just a comment. Shade, can you tell us more?
Hi, Mark. I was just thinking, I understand where you're coming from, and I've had that sense as well, that sometimes we spend so much time looking at what hasn't gone well. But I still think we should still look at that anyway, because there might be obvious things that we can actually fix as well. Yeah, but I do understand looking at celebrating the successes and looking at how we can make that even, make it repetitive for the team.
Definitely. I think for me, it's not about like replacing the way that we normally do continuous improvement retrospectives with this appreciative inquiry all the time. I think it's more like trying to redress the balance a little bit. Like my balance has been like sort of 90-10 in one direction for certainly the last few years, and I think trying to get it to a point where it's at least like, even if it's like 70-30, to make I think it'd be like totally foolish and irresponsible to leave behind the things that you're not good at and just ignore them and hope they go away. But I think it's like, my point is as well, like, we need to make sure we look at the whole data set, and there's like 100% of data there, so let's look at every bit of that.
Oh, thank you.
No problems.
No. Please, Manish.
Oh, hi. Thanks for sharing this. One thought that comes to mind here, and something that I've often experienced is, I think it's great. It's fantastic to focus on the strengths and explore those. But I guess the strengths as well, they come from within a context of what success means, right, for the team. So do you find that there is some alignment on what the individuals and the team as a whole deem as success before they go into this kind of analysis of strengths?
I think like typically, I guess by trying to like separate two sort of like ways of thinking about success here, because I think there's like thinking about success like our product that we've got at market has got 75% basket completion rate or whatever. That's like a success metric, right? And that's like a thing that you can measure, and that's probably like outcome driven or OKR driven or whatever it might be. And I think that's like kind of a thing that you need to like analyze as a whole, like when it happens, if it happens. And so I think there should be alignment on that, because I think you should like naturally be looking at the root cause of things after they've happened if they're successful. I think like the point I'm trying to make in the deck more is like the things that people see as success in like the ways that they're doing their work.
Capability.
Capability, and like how they communicate with other teams, and how like they so like I wouldn't, for example, have it like as a success metric on our team that they need to minimize the amount of meetings they have and maximize the amount of tickets they get through on Jira. Obviously, we all like that's like a very like concrete way of thinking about it, or very objective way of thinking about it. But like sort of people going into their retrospectives and say it's been so straightforward to be productive this week. Like I don't think you really need to align on that as being a success. I think you just
I see. Yes.
You see what I mean? So like I think there's two different things with it. There's like one is that like really objective, like this is objectively a success. We've released the software on time and it's got 1 million users. Let's work out how we did that. And that's like what I think I mentioned the point 3 on the key takeaways was this isn't just about retrospectives, it's also about using it for those big wins of that, which that would be one. But then like the more like sort of a regular thing of like constantly iterating on the way that we're doing things well and trying to do more of things we do well, I think is like a slightly different mindset.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Manish, for the question. I think we have time for just another question, but feel free. Anyone from anyone? Okay.
Do you ask people on the teams which skills they want?
I have a patchy history of doing that. I think I try to. I think I certainly try to take a kind of like a real close interest in people's personal development, because I think like understanding people's motivators makes it easier to get the best out of them on the work that they're doing. And you can normally match up motivators with the work that people do. I think that I've previously done that in a really like not factual way, but like a real data collection way. So like send like a survey with like score yourself on these sort of 20 things and 1 to 5, how good are you at them, and then try and help them out in that way. I think what I'm finding now is that like I much prefer the conversation with people, and we've got a way of doing feedback on our teams where we're trying to understand, because I'm a delivery manager for people who are line managed by other people, but now we're trying to get to a point where I have a more regular dialogue with their line manager, so I understand their outcomes and their objectives, and then help them find work to that extent. So yes, I think so.
Supplementally, have you heard of lean scenes?
I haven't.
A lean scene is an internal business story. So in the way that you've got a user story that takes the customer stuff, with a lean scene, you can get a team member to write a way that they think they can improve the process.
Nice.
And then they put in what they think the benefits will be to operations.
Nice.
And to strategy. And then you give them 6 weeks to try it out. So it may not be on the iteration cycle.
Yeah.
And the way that they do it is using a thing called flow racking. So as computer programmers, we're meant to take a 15-minute break every 2 hours. So in that 15 minutes, you can then put in the stuff that you're doing on your lean scene to bring it up. And then after, so you can measure as you go. And then after 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, you start to see the outputs and the outcomes. Outcomes are easier to measure. So it's back to that QA, QC. And it means that the person can come up. And if they get so interested, you can then get them Sophia graded on the new skills that they've got, which means that the company then has a learning metric that's gone up.
Yeah, nice.
But only if they're interested. It's a bit like playing a musical instrument.
You've got to be engaged in the first place.
Or getting around the 26 miles under 4 hours. Not me, mate. Under 6 hours, perhaps. Cool. Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay. Any more from any more? Okay, good. I think we had a good Q&A session at the end. Mark, you see, same time as the deck as a pro. No, I'm very happy for that. I have just one question before closing that I added here in the chat. Let's think about an example of the last hours, I would say, that is considered pretty negative, like the COP26. I heard a lot of bad comments on that. So what do you think about instead the opportunity to change the perspective and to highlight what actually went well instead of what didn't go well? What could be the impact? I mean, talking to normal people, not just an agile team. What do you think?
Are you asking me specifically here? Well, so I'll try to get an answer, but I'm gonna fluff my lines a bit here. But I think I actually would be quite interested in playing this back to the people in the room and like trying to like encourage them to think about that in a positive way. Like maybe this is homework you can take away and have a think about.
Anyone that's worked as an educator has always encouraged to try and find something positive to say about somebody's work, even if you think it's you know, kind of like one of the lowest. So you know, it's like, and it's the cliches that you start with something positive. Yeah. But I don't agree with that. I just think that, you know, it shouldn't go with a formula. But I think the tendency can be, whether it's, well, for myself, I think I'm much more likely to look at what I didn't do right rather than what I did do right. And I think the tendency is with, you know, say, you know, in a situation where it's a teacher, student, whatever, facilitator, team, the tendency can be to, you know, to dwell on the negative things as opposed to the positive, which I guess is kind of what you've been saying, right? Is that part of what you?
Yeah, totally. And I'll come back to Corrado, to your question in a minute. But I think like one of the things that you picked up on there was, I don't want to use the swear word, but the sandwich that we're all aware of.
Yeah, the sandwich. Yeah.
Of using positive, negative, positive.
Yeah.
And I guess like what this, like a lot of British inquiry, or like how I've understood it, is trying to like say against that is that's not how positive behavior should be used. Positive behavior should be used like in the same level of rigor that we put the negative part of the sandwich in.
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just formulaic, isn't it?
Yeah. It deserves its own forum. Like if I would say you did a really brilliant job of that thing, that wherever it may be, you deserve to hear why that was good and why you did that well, so you can do more of that later.
Yeah. I think, you know, that horrible word "but," you know, needs to be eliminated from, you know, like, because people just come to expect it, and you don't need to frame it like that. You know, it doesn't. You don't need the buts in that dialogue, if you know what I mean.
Corrado, to your question a minute ago, I guess like the honest answer is I'm not on top of environmental improvements across Europe as much as I should be, across the world as much as I should be. But I like, for example, I like to think that if we like took a particular country that was doing a really good job of the way that it managed its recycling, say I'm going to put a punt and say that the Nordics are probably doing it better than we are in Great Britain. There must be things in the way that they've done that and incentivized that to their population that we could learn from in the way that we do it here, or the entirety of Europe or the world could learn from the way that they do it there. There simply must be countries that are doing each individual element.
That's a great example
of it better than we are. And so, like, if we want to get to, well, I think I want electric cars in, or as it like there'll be increased taxation on petrol by 2035 or whatever it is. Like who is the world leader in electric cars in terms of like population uptake, and what do they do, and then how do we make sure we do that? So we just do it, or we do it and do more of it, so we do it as effectively as possible.
Yeah, and maybe also new technologies that happened since the last conferences that enhance the possibility to adopt a greener approach. I like the example of the countries that did something very well, because it's something that can be adopted at least in the region. Not say that everywhere, but maybe I don't know. Just mention. I remember a note about how many families in Israel actually are using solar boiling water, it's a big percentage, and so I think that also in the area this could be applied. Okay, but I think that's a good example. I think really helpful. Okay, just before closing, if you can give me a few seconds, I want to share the screen of the tag cloud, just for your let me say eyes. Okay, I think that this is coming more and more interesting. We have collected roughly 50 people sharing their opinion on what are the attributes of the agile mindset. So if this is really helpful, if you want to talk to your teams, what is the agile mindset? I think this could help. So thank you for sharing this across the community. And I'm using this every time, reusing the same tag cloud. So I think has some value. So thank you for making this possible. And thank you, Mark, for sharing this. Really interesting. You will find the video on YouTube, with the time that I can manage. Okay. And thank you, Jack, for arranging this session. Hopefully we will have another session next year, okay, on another topic or something like that. So keep in touch and stay tuned. And thank you for all of you for joining. I think it was a great session. I love it. A very new perspective. So thank you for that.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.